Aleichem and welcome to Parsha Lomdus, Parshas Korach. The first thing we're going to look at is a word from the Rogatchover on the beginning of the Parsha, where he explains what exactly Korach's taina was and what was the svaras hamachlokes between Korach and Moshe Rabeinu. And he explains it based on a chakira. And he says, whenever we have two things, and I find that the second thing has a toisvus maila over the first thing. The second thing has an additional quality over the first thing. So I could say pshat in two ways. I can either say that these two things, whatever they have in common, in that they're equal. The only difference is that the second thing has an additional maila. So in that additional maila, in that the second thing is greater than the first thing. But in all those things that they are equal, in that they're taka equal. Or I could say no. Once the second thing has a toisvus maila, once the second thing has an additional quality, a greater quality, so that changes the whole metzias, and the second thing becomes a metzias acheres legamri, and it has nothing in common with the first thing anymore. So a simple example of this would be, we have kehanim, and we have kehanim gedolim. So a kohen gadol, besides for being a kohen, has an additional maila, an additional quality, that he is a kohen gadol. So I can say two svaras. I can either say that a kohen gadol and a kohen hedyot, in those areas where they are the same, those dinim where they are the same, they are the same. Norva then the kohen gadol has an additional maila, and mitzad the additional maila, there's other halachas and other criteria and other things which are taken into account because of the additional maila in the kohen gadol. But al kaponim, the kohen gadol still has in common with the kohen hedyot whatever they have in common. Or I could say no. Since the kohen gadol is a kohen gadol, he has a toisvus maila and a toisvus kedusha, so that makes him a metzias acheres legamri, and he has nothing in common with a kohen hedyot. A kohen hedyot and a kohen gadol are two different creatures altogether. Same thing I can say by kehanim and levim. Do I say that in those areas where kehanim and levim are the same, they are the same, and the only difference is that kehanim have something additional above the levim? Or do I say no? Since kehanim have something additional, this makes them a metzias acheres legamri, and there's nothing in common between kehanim and levim. So let's take a nafkamina b'poyel. We know that when it came to Shmira in the Beis Hamikdash, guarding the Beis Hamikdash, there was a mitzvah, it's also in the sixth Parsha, to guard the Beis Hamikdash. So this Shmira was performed by kehanim and levim. Levim guarded in 21 places, and the kehanim guarded in 3 places. So in the din Shmira, l'chayra, kehanim and levim are the same. They both act as shomrim to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Mishkan. So if I say like the first svara, so it would come out that in this din of Shmira, kehanim and levim are the same. There should be no maila in the Shmira of a kohen over the Shmira of a Levi. Since kehanim and levim both act as shomrim, something which they have in common, so in those areas where they have common ground, they're the same. But if I say that, no, since a kohen has an additional maila over a Levi, therefore a kohen is a metzias acheres legamri, so therefore even in those areas where they're the same, a kohen has to be gar anders, a kohen has to be completely different. So even when it comes to Shmira, seemingly both the kehanim and the levim are doing Shmira, but the Shmira of the kehanim has to be in a whole different way. So Taka, if we look in the Gemara, Maseches Tamid, the Gemara tells us that when it came to Shmira, ha-kehanim shomrim l'mayla, and levim shomrim l'mata. We're going to talk more about this later in the Shiur, when we talk about the mitzvah of Shmira. But al kaponim, the Gemara says that there is a difference. Kehanim, they guard above. They're on higher ground. They built aliyas, they built platforms for the kehanim to stand above. So the kehanim are guarding milamayla, and the levim have to stand milamata. So I see here that even though they're both acting as kehanim, they're both acting as shomrim, nevertheless there's a difference. Even in this din of Shmira, kehanim have a maila. Says the Rogatchover, this was exactly what Korach and Moshe were arguing about. Korach felt that, like the first svara, Korach held that whenever two things, whatever they have in common, so what they have in common, they're the same. It's true that some things might have an additional maila. Okay, that's the additional maila. But where two things are the same, they should be the same. And therefore, Korach felt that when it came to the Shmira of the Kohanim and the Levim, the Kohanim and Levim should guard on equal ground. There shouldn't be a mile in the Shmira of Kohanim over the Levim, because in this inyan they're both the same, so they should be the same. So Korach was not arguing that Kohanim and Levim are the same. Of course, Korach understands that Kohanim are greater. In those things where Kohanim are greater, let Kohanim be greater. But in those things where Kohanim and Levim are supposed to be the same, for example, the mitzvah of Shmira, there Korach wanted that they should be the same, and they should guard on the same level. But Moshe Rabeinu said no. Moshe held like the second svara, that once a kohen has an additional maila, that makes a kohen a metzias acheres legamri, and the kohen has no common ground with the Levi. And even in those things where seemingly b'shitchias, b'chitzonius, kohanim and levim are the same, even there a kohen is a whole different metzias, and a kohen is a whole different story. And therefore, even in the dinim of Shmira, a kohen has to guard l'mayla, and a Levi has to guard l'mata. And the Rogatchover says an amazing thing, that even though this din, that kohanim guard milamayla, and levim guard milamata, is said in the Torah, but it's only said after the story of Korach. Later in the Parsha, towards the end, this din is taught from the pasuk v'nilvu eilecha. But at the point of Korach's machlokes with Moshe Rabeinu, the Eibishter had not yet said this din, that kohanim are going to guard milamayla and levim milamata. Yet Moshe Rabeinu did it on his own. He says Moshe also came midaitai. Moshe understood al das atzmai, that this is the way it is. He says the lashon because Moshe is etzem haTorah, and Moshe intuitively understood what the Torah wants, and that was what caused the machlokes of Korach and Moshe Rabeinu. Korach came to Moshe and said, "What are you doing? Why are you telling the kohanim to guard l'mayla? In this inyan, kohanim and levim are the same. Ki kol ha'eda kulam kedoshim. Madua tisnasu in this prat, where seemingly we're supposed to be the same, why even there are you making a hisnasus?" And Moshe said no. Because once a kohen, as we said, is hecher, once a kohen is higher, then it's a metzias acher as the gamri, and he no longer has any tad hashava with a kohen hedyot. Sorry, he no longer has a tad hashava with a Levi. The Rogatchover brings that we have the same idea by a kohen gadol and a kohen hedyot. There's a machlokes in Gemara whether the avnei of the kohen gadol is the same as the avnei of a kohen hedyot. Do they wear the same avnei, or is it a different avnei? So the Rogatchover says it's the same machlokes. It's the same machlokes. If you hold that a kohen gadol is like the first tzvara, he's a kohen hedyot plus he's an additional mile of being a kohen gadol, but he has some common ground with a kohen hedyot, then you would say that the avnei of the kohen gadol is the same as the avnei of the kohen hedyot. They have certain things that are the same. So yes, the kohen gadol wears shmoina begadim, and the kohen hedyot wears 4 begadim, but in those 4 begadim they could be the same. So the avnei could be the same. But if you hold like the svar of Moshe Rabeinu, that once something has a taisus maila, it's a metzias acheres legamri, and it has nothing in common anymore with the first thing, then you would say that the avnei of the kohen gadol is not the same avnei, because there's nothing in common. The kohen gadol is a metzias acheres legamri, and even his avnei, which could be the same, is not the same, and it has to be different. On in the Parsha to the mitzvah of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash. As we said before, in this week's Parsha we have the mitzvah saseh, that we have to guard the Beis Hamikdash. So there's a very interesting tshuva from the Avnei Nezer. It's in Yeridea, segment.Matnos, and there somebody asked him whether or not there's a chiyuv or a mitzvah of Shmiras Mokim Hamikdash Bizman Hazeh. Bizman Hazeh, we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, but we have the Mokim Hamikdash. And we know that the Rambam tells us the Mokim Hamikdash still has Kedusha. So if the Kedushas Mokim Beis Hamikdash is still intact, this person was asking, is there still Bizman Hazeh, could there be a chiyuv of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash, Shmiras Mokim Hamikdash nowadays? So the Avnei Nezer first wants to say that no, because the Shmira is only to do with the actual building of the Beis Hamikdash and the kelim in the Beis Hamikdash, and even though the Rambam says that we're not guarding because of fear of somebody stealing, we're guarding because of kavod, but again, the tzura of the Shmira is that we're guarding the actual building and we're guarding the kelim, and if there's no Beis Hamikdash and there's no kelim, then obviously there's no concept of Shmira's Beis Hamikdash. But then he says, actually, no. Perhaps one of the reasons to guard the Beis Hamikdash was to prevent people who are Tamei from going there. A person who's Tamei is not allowed to go into the Makim Hamikdash. And perhaps that was part of the reason why we had Shomrim around the Beis Hamikdash. And if that's the case, then nowadays, maybe there should be an inyan of Shmira. Because nowadays, still, people who are Tamei are not allowed to go in the Makim HaMikdash. And if that's the reason, or that's one of the reasons, then there should be a need and a chiyuv even bisman hazeh for Shmira around the Makim HaMikdash. So he wants to say that it's going to be tolui in the following question. Is Shmiras Beis HaMikdash, which is again performed by Kehanim and Levim, does that have a gather of Avodah or not? Because Kehanim and Levim perform certain Avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. So is the Shmiras Beis HaMikdash, is it a chelik of the Avodah? Does it have a gather of Avodah? Or is it a separate inyan? You have to guard the Beis HaMikdash. So he wants to say that it's machlokes between the Rambam and Tosfos in one camp and the Mefarish to Maseches Tamid in another camp. He brings a rayas from Tosfos, from Rambam and from Tosfos, that the Shmira by the Kehanim had to be done in the Bigdei Kehuna. That when the Kehanim stood guard, they guarded in the Bigdei Kehuna. So if that's the shit of the Rambam and of Tosfos, it's not Mefurish, but that's how he brings rayas why he thinks that's the case. So if the Kehanim have to do Shmira in the Bigdei Kehuna, that is a heichacha that it's begeder avodah. They're doing the avodah. Shmir is a chelik of the avodah, and has to be done in the Bigdei Kehuna. However, he says the Mefarish to Maseches Tamid brings that, based on the lashon of the Mishnah there, that even Ktanim, even Kehanim who are Ktanim, were able to participate in the Shmira. Shmira's Beis Hamikdash by the Kehanim was done by even Ktanim. So he says that's a raya that according to the Mefarish, Shmira is not begeder avodah. Because if Shmira was begeder avodah, then how could a Katan do it? A Katan is not shaykh to do the avodah. So if the Mefarish holds that a Katan could do the avodah, that a Katan could do Shmira, must be that the Shmira is not begeder avodah, it's a separate inyan. So based on this, he wants to say would be the answer to our question. If you hold that Shmira is a chelik of the avodah, has a gather of avodah like the Rambam and Tosfos, then to do it you have to be a kohen in Bigdei Kehuna, and for sure you have to be tahor. If a kohen is tamei, he cannot perform the avodah. So if a kohen is tamei, he can't perform shmira. So according to the Rambam and the Tosfos, nowadays it wouldn't be shaykh to do shmira because it has a gather of avodah, and all the kehanim today are becheskes tamei. But according to the Mefarish, that it's not a gather of avodah, it's a separate inyan, so perhaps even nowadays there could be an inyan for. So staying on the topic of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam writes that the mitzvah of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash is only balayla. Only at night is there a need to guard the Beis Hamikdash. By day there was no need for shomrim. Azay shteit in Rambam. And the Minchas Chinuch asks a very simple question. Says LeTorah, he doesn't understand what's the makir of the Rambam. Doesn't say anywhere in the Gemara. He doesn't know of any makir where it should say that the mitzvah of Shmira is only balayla. And he says since the inyan of the Shmira is not mipnei pachad listim, but it's because of kavod, so it shouldn't make a difference. If it's mitzad kavod, he says paik chazi, go and look. All palaces, all kings have shomrim balayla ubayayim. So the Beis Hamikdash mitzad kavod should require shomrim also by day. He doesn't understand why the Rambam says that the mitzvah of Shmira is only balayla. And the Minchas Chinuch ends off by saying perhaps the Rambam saw it in some kind of a brisa that we don't have anymore. But he leaves it as a tzarech iyun why the Rambam would say that the mitzvah of Shmira is only balayla. The Rebbe addresses this kasha in a sicha, in Likkutei Sichos, Chelik Yud Gimel, Parshas Korach, and the Rebbe wants to answer it based on an amazing chidush. He says that there's a Rosh. The Rosh in Maseches Tamid, the Rosh explains that what's the gather of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash? The gather of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash is that the Yidden should not be Masiach Das from the Beis Hamikdash. That's the inyan. The inyan is why are we guarding the Beis Hamikdash? We're guarding the Beis Hamikdash so that will never be Masiyach Das from the Beis Hamikdash. And it's compared, he says, to the din by tzitz, that as long as the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz, he's not allowed to be Masiyach Das from the tzitz. And we have the same din nowadays by tefillin, that as long as a person is wearing tefillin, he's not allowed to be Masiyach Das from the fact that he's wearing tefillin. He has to constantly be aware that he's wearing tefillin. So al derech zeh, when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash, the Rosh is saying, what's the inyan of Shmiras Beis Hamikdash? Because there's a collective tzivui on Klal Yisrael not to be Masiyach Das from the Beis Hamikdash. Klal Yisrael has to always be mindful and always be aware of the Beis Hamikdash. And that's the reason why we have Shomrim guarding the Beis Hamikdash. So that way, we're constantly and actively focusing our attention on the Beis Hamikdash, and we're going to avoid any inyan of Hesach Hadas. That's the shita of the Rosh in Maseches Tamid. And if that's the case, it's understood why the Rambam would say that the chiyuv of Shmira is only Balayla. He says because B'yayim, the Beis Hamikdash is full of activity. We have the Avodah. Everything is going on. During the day, the Beis Hamikdash is active. The Kohanim are all over the place during the day. So there's no chance of an inyan of Hesach Hadas during the day. Of course, Bnei Yisrael is focused on the Beis Hamikdash B'yayim. So there's clearly no need for Shmira B'yayim. The only need for Shmira is Balayla. Balayla, everybody goes to sleep. So if everybody went to sleep and nobody was awake in the Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Hamikdash was left alone, that would be a Hesach Hadas of the Beis Hamikdash. So for that we have the chiyuv of Shmira, and it's Dafka Balayla, in order that there shouldn't be a Hesach Hadas from the Beis Hamikdash, so we have Shomrim guarding, and this way we're constantly, 24 hours a day, we're constantly focused on the Beis Hamikdash. So that would be an answer to the Kasha of the Minchas Chinuch, and a reason why the Rambam would say that the chiyuv of Shmira is only Balayla. Based on this word, we can also explain something else that we mentioned before. We brought from the Mefarish that who was guarding the Beis Hamikdash could even be Ktanim. Even Kohanim who were Ktanim could guard the Beis Hamikdash. And a lot of Achronim asked the Kasha, including the Mishnah Lamelech and the Minchas Chinuch, L'chayra, how could you have Ktanim doing it? Ktanim are La B'nei Shimur, they're not B'nei Das. Bichlal, where do we find Ktanim doing something, especially of this importance, of this significance? So how could it be, how could we have here a Metzias where the Shmiras Beis Hamikdash is being done by Ktanim? So based on this word, the Rebbe wants to answer it like this. He says that the Mishnah tells us that there was a Ish Har Habayis who was in charge of the Shomrim, and he would go around from post to post making sure that all of the Shomrim were awake. That was his job. So perhaps this Ish Har Habayis, who was clearly a Gadol, he was an adult, perhaps that can be considered like a Gadol Oimed al Gabav. There are certain things that if a Katan does it, but there's a Gadol Oimed al Gabav, there's a Gadol standing on top of him, telling him what to do, telling him how to do it, etc., etc., he's being coached by a Gadol Oimed al Gabav, then it counts. So in our situation, we could say the same thing. Since, as we just explained, what's the whole inyan of the Shmira? The whole inyan of the Shmira is to be Shoydel Hesach Hadas, that the Yidden should not be Masiyach Das from the Beis Hamikdash. So that's why the Shomrim are standing there. So the Ish Har Habayis is doing the same thing. The Ish Har Habayis is going around and he's making sure all the Shomrim are awake, and he's making sure nobody fell asleep. He's also engaged in this activity of being Shoydel Hesach Hadas. So the Ish Har Habayis is not he's not doing something else. He's a chelak of the project. The whole project of Shmira, which is to be Shoydel Hesach Hadas, the Ish Har Habayis is part of it. His going around is also being Shoydel the Hesach Hadas. So b'meila, even if you have Ktanim that are doing the Shmira, since the Ish Har Habayis is coming around and he's telling them, stay awake, stay focused, pay attention, think about the Beis Hamikdash, look at the Beis Hamikdash, don't let your mind wander. Since the Ish Har Habayis is doing that, he's taking part in the Shlilas Hesach Hadas, which is the whole point of the Shmira. So in a way, it's like a Gadol Oimed al Gabav, and if the Gadol is Oimed al Gabav, then even if you have a Katan doing it works. Moving on to the next topic, and that is the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben. So here we're going to take a look at a vart from Rabbi Yosef Engel in Tziyunim LeTorah, a Moedadik vart that he has in the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben. But first, before we get there, a quick hakdama. The Gemara in Kiddushin says that when it comes to Pidyon Haben, there's a mitzvah on the father to be paida his son. And that we learn from the pasuk in Shmiras, v'chol b'char banecha tifteh. And then, let's say the father was not paida his son. So then when the son becomes older, he has a chiyuv to be paida himself. And that we learn from a pasuk in our parsha where it says, ach padei sivda. From that riboy we learn that the person should be paida himself if his father was not paida him. So there's a famous chakira here in the mitzvah Pidyon Haben, and that is, what's the ikar mitzvah? I can say pshat in two ways. I can either say the ikar mitzvah is on the person himself. The ikar chiyuv of Pidyon is the person has a chiyuv to be paida himself. But since when a person is born, they're a baby, they don't have the ability to be paida themselves, so therefore, b'payel mamesh, who has to do it? The father. So the father's doing it sort of on behalf of the baby. The ikar chiyuv is on the b'chayr himself. Since he cannot do it, so the father does it on his behalf. That's one svara. Or the other svara is fakert, that the ikar chiyuv is on the father. The father has a chiyuv, that's a mitzvah to be paida his son, that's the ikar chiyuv. And it's only if that wasn't done, then the son should be paida himself, because to be left without b'diya, that's not an option. But the ikar mitzvah is on the father. So the truth is that this is a machlokes rishonim. The Chinuch writes in our Parsha, the Chinuch writes that the ikar mitzvah is on the father. It's ikar the father's mitzvah to be paida his son. And therefore, even if the son became a gadol, the father is still able to do the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben on behalf of his son. So that's the shit of the Chinuch. And then you have the shit of the Rivash. The Rivash says fakert. The ikar mitzvah is on the b'chayr himself. The b'chayr himself, he has the ikar mitzvah to be paida himself. It's only that since he can't, because he's a baby, the father does it on his behalf. And the fiza would come out that once the person is a gadol and he's able to be paida himself, the father no longer is able to be paida his son, because it's not the father's mitzvah. It's be'ikar the son's mitzvah to be paida himself. And based on this, the Rivash wants to say that there's a difference in the bracha. When the father is the one doing the Pidyon Haben on behalf of his son, you make the bracha al Pidyon Haben. But when the son is being paida himself, the bracha is asher kedeshanu b'mitzvah v'tzivanu liftois, because the ikar chiyuv, as we said, is on the person himself to be paida himself. That's the Hakadama. So based on this, Yosef Engel wants to say pshat in a Gemara in Kiddushin. The Gemara in Kiddushin brings up a situation where hu liftois u'benoi liftois, that the father has two things to do. He has to be paida himself because he was never redeemed, and he has to be paida his son because he had a son. So what comes first? So it says machlokes Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda, but the shit of Rabbi Yehuda is benoi kaidem. So the Gemara explains, and that's Rabbi Yosef Engel in his words explains it in this way. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Why does the son come first? Because the ikar chiyuv, as we said, he goes with the mahalach of the chinuch. The ikar chiyuv is, the ikar mitzvah is on the father to be paida his son. And it's only if that didn't happen, then betur hashlama, as a hashlama, the son should be paida himself. So therefore, that's the svar of Rabbi Yehuda. Hu liftois u'benoi liftois, the son comes first, because that's the chiyuv atzmi. That's the mitzvah atzmi. The mitzvah atzmi is to be paida your son. The chiyuv to be paida yourself really was your father's chiyuv. Since he didn't do it, as a hashlama, you have to do it. So a hashlama comes second. Where do we see that a hashlama comes second? We see it by tefillah. If a person didn't daven shachris, so the din is they have to daven mincha twice. And the first Shemona Esrei is for mincha, and the second one is a hashlama for shachris. So what do we see there? That when the person is davening mincha, he has two things to do. He has the chiyuv of now, the chiyuv atzmi, and then that's mincha. Then he has the chiyuv hashlama to make up shachris. So the chiyuv atzmi comes first, and the chiyuv hashlama comes later. So al derech zeh over here is the same thing. Hu liftois u'benoi liftois, since being paida your son is the chiyuv atzmi, that's the real chiyuv, that's the essential chiyuv, so that comes first. And the chiyuv to be paida yourself is just a hashlama, because really it was your father's chiyuv to be paida you. So that's a hashlama, that comes later. That's Rabbi Yosef Engel explains the shit of Rabbi Yehuda, hu liftois u'benoi liftois, that benoi kaiden. It's interesting that the Gemara goes on to say the Rabbi Yirmiyah says that really, if the father only has 5 sloim, then everybody agrees that the father is paida himself. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees the father will be paida himself, because mitzvah begufei odif. They only argue in a case where there's 10 sloim, 5 are b'nei chayrin and 5 are meshubadim. So now they argue. According to the Tana Kama, then we say he should be paida himself first, using the nechasim b'nei chayrin, and as far as the pediya of his son, we'll have to deal with the meshubadim and the buyers, and that's a whole different discussion. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, fakert, the son comes first. He should be paida his son using the 5 b'nei chayrin, and for his own pediya, we'll worry about it later with the meshubadim. So Rabbi Yosef Engel explains, why now does Rabbi Yehuda say b'nei kaidem? Why if there's only 5 sloim, does even Rabbi Yehuda agree that he should be paida himself? What happened to the svara that the chiv to be paida your son is the chiv atzmi, and the chiv to be paida yourself is only a hashlama? So why, if there's only 5 sloim, all of a sudden do we say that he should be paida himself, even according to Rabbi Yehuda? So here he says, because there's another svara of chayecha kaidmin. That's the lashon the Gemara says mitzvah begufei odif. There's a mitzvah of chayecha. There's an inyan of chayecha kaidmin. So it's true that if you weigh the 2 chiyuvim, the chiyuv to be paida your son is a greater chiyuv. Als the cheftza of the chiyuv, it's a greater chiyuv. But mitzad chayecha kaidmin, if you only have 5 sloim and you use the 5 sloim for your son, so then the father is going to be left himself without any pediya. He's going to be left with nothing. So mitzad chayecha kaidmin, he should be paida himself if he only has 5 sloim. But if he has 10, 5 are b'nei chayrin and 5 are meshubadim, then again Rabbi Yehuda will say, since the father really has 10 sloim, and he has a way later, by taking the properties away from the buyers, he has a way to take care of his own pediya, because he has potentially 10 sloim. So there's no inyan of chayecha kaidmin. Chayecha kaidmin is only in a situation where the father is going to be left with no pediya at all, like if there's only 5 sloim. Then we say chayecha kaidmin, and the father is paida himself. But if there's 10 sloim, 5 b'nei chayrin and 5 meshubadim, then Rabbi Yehuda will say that b'nei kaidem, use the b'nei chayrin easily to be paida the son, because that's the bigger chiyuv. And don't tell me chayecha kaidmin, don't worry, you'll have a way to take care of yourself. It's going to be more complicated. You have to deal with properties that were already sold and taking it away, but there's a way to do it. So therefore, b'nei kaidem, take the 5 sloim b'nei chayrin and be paida your son. And then after that, because that has a din kedima, that's the chiv atzmi, and then take care of the hashlama, the chiv hashlama, which is to be paida himself, using the 5 sloim mishabadim. It's going to be more complicated, but he'll still have a way to do it. That's how Yosef Engel explains that Gemara. It's also interesting to note that the Rebbe in Likkutei Sichos, Chelek Yud Aleph, I think it's a Sicha in Parshas Beis, the Rebbe wants to say that this chakir that we started with, is Pidyon Haben really a chiyuv on the father be'ikr to be paida his son, like the Chinuch and Yosef Engel want to say, or is it like the Rivosh, that it's be'ikr on the person himself to be paida himself? It's just that he can't do it, so the father does it. The Rebbe wants to say that it's actually a machlekes Bavli and Yerushalmi. The Bavli, as we said, learns the two things from different psukim. In Parshas Boy, v'chol b'chor banecha tifte, from there we learn that the father has a chiyuv to be paid himself. And it's from the pasuk in our Parsha, ach podei sifte, that we learn from the extra podei sifte, that if that didn't happen, the son is paid himself. So the fizeh would come out like the mahalach of the Chinuch and Rabbi Yosef Engel. So the ikar limud is v'chol b'chor banecha tifte. That's the ikar limud, that the mitzvah is for the father to be paid his son. There's another pasuk later that says, by the way, if that didn't happen, ach podei sifta, you should be paid yourself. But that comes much later, and that's secondary. The ikar pasuk and the ikar chiyuv is b'v'chol b'chor banecha tifta. But in the Yerushalmi learns both from the same pasuk. The pasuk says v'chol b'chor adam b'vanecha tifta. So v'chol b'chor banecha tifta. From there we learn that the father has to be paid his son. But from the word Adam, v'chol b'chor Adam b'vanecha tifta, from the extra word Adam, the Yerushalmi learns that the son should be paid to himself. So according to that, since both dinim are learned from the same pasuk at the same time, not like the Bavli where we have one pasuk first saying v'chol b'char banecha tifta, and only much later a new pasuk to say ach padei sifta, that you should be paid to yourself. But according to the Yerushalmi, no. V'chol b'char odem b'vanecha tifta b'vas achas. At the same time, the pasuk introduced both chiyuvim, that the father should be paid to the son, and the son should be paid to himself. Since both dinim are taught at the same time in the same pasuk, it's mistaber to say that the ikr chiyuv is like the rivosh. The ikr chiyuv is on the son to be paid to himself, and the father is only doing it on behalf of the son, since the son cannot do it. And again, the nafkamina would be when the son becomes a gadol. At that point, does the father still have a mitzvah or a chiyuv to be paid to the son, or is it completely transferred to the son? Ladas Chinuch, even if the son becomes a gadol, the father still has the chiyuv to be paid to his son. Nothing was transferred. And according to the Rivash, which is now also the Yerushalmi, since the ikr chiyuv is on the son, it's only that when he was a Katan he couldn't, so the father was doing it on his behalf. So b'meila, once the son becomes a gadol, the chiyuv transfers completely to him, and the father no longer has any mitzvah whatsoever to be. Moving on towards the end of the parsha, where we have the Matnos Kehuna, and at the very end we have the mitzvah of Trumas Meiser, which is that after a Levi receives his Meiser from the Yid, the Levi has to give 10% of that to a Kohen. That's called Trumas Meiser. And there we have a pasuk, V'nechshav lachem trumaschem. So the Gemara in Gittin Daf Lamed learns from this pasuk, V'nechshav lachem trumaschem, that both by Truma Gedola, which is the Truma that a Yid gives directly to a Kohen, and by Trumas Meiser, which is what a Levi gives to a Kohen, by both of them, V'nechshav lachem, you can take Truma Bmachshava. It can be done Bmachshava, even without saying any words. Just by thinking, you can accomplish the Hafrashas HaTruma. It's a very mechudesh tikkedin. So the Minchas Chinuch points out that Pshat here is a machlokes between the Rambam and Tosfos and Rashi. He says, according to the Rambam and Tosfos, you cannot accomplish Hafrashas Truma with only Machshava. There has to be a Maisa Hafrasha, which means you have to actually separate part of it for the Truma. And then, so you have the Maisa Hafrasha, and all the Gemara is saying is that you don't actually have to utter the words Bedibur Harezu Truma. You can just think. You can think the words that this should be Truma, and the Machshava of thinking this should be Truma, together with the Maisa Hafrasha, even without a verbal declaration, can accomplish the inyan of the Truma. That's the opinion of the Rambam and of Tosfos. But the Minchas Chinuch says, according to Rashi says the lashon noisen einav betzad zeh v'oichel betzad zeh, that you just look at one side and you think that side should be Truma, and you can eat the other side. Meaning, according to Rashi, there doesn't even have to be a Maisa Hafrasha. You can just Bmachshava alone, just with thinking that you want that side, let's say the right side, to be the Truma side, just with that alone, without any dibur, without any Maisa, you accomplish the Hafrashas Truma, and you can already start eating on the left side, and what you're eating is no longer Tevel, because you are Mafresh Truma B'machshava. So this is the machlokes between the Rambam and Tosfos and Rashi. It's very interesting that Reb Levik, in a letter to the Rebbe, there was apparently an exchange between them about this concept, and Reb Levik wants to taina that even according to Rashi, it's not mamish that you can be mafresh truma b'machshava. And the way he explains it is like this. He says, anytime a person is mafresh truma, two things happen. Number one, the rest of the food that's left behind becomes mutar b'achila. Before your mafresh truma, it's osur, it's tevel. After your mafresh truma, whatever's left behind becomes mutar. That's one thing. And the second thing that happens is the chelik that you are mafresh l'shem truma, that becomes truma. There's a chalois shem truma on that, and ad kedei kach that if a zor would eat that, the zor would be chayiv misa b'dei shamayim for eating truma. So that's the two things that happen when you're mafresh truma. You're matir b'achila, the rest, the stuff that's being left behind, and you're causing the chalois kedusha, chalois shem truma on the part that you were mafresh. So Levik wants to say that even according to Rashi, that's nice and ein of betzad zeh v'oichel betzad acher, that there's no ma'aseh hafrasha, as we said. But Bmachshava alone you can accomplish truma. Levik wants to say that's only as far as the first din of being matir, what's left behind la'achila. Before you couldn't eat it because it was tevel. So if you're mafresh truma b'machshava, nois and ein b'tzad zeh v'oichel b'tzad acher, the machshava only helps as far as being matir, the stuff that's staying behind, that should be mutter b'achila. But b'machshava you cannot make a chalois shem truma on the part that you were mafresh. That should be considered truma. Ad kedei kach, that if a zor ate it, the zor would be chai misa b'tei shamayim. Even Rashi would agree that b'machshava that cannot happen. For a chalois kedusha, for a chalois shem truma on the part that you were mafresh, for that clearly you need a dibur, a declaration that this should be truma, and only through a verbal declaration is the shem truma chal on the hafrasha. What the Gemara means that you can take truma b'machshava is only as far as being matir everything else la'achila. That according to Rashi you could do b'machshava even without a ma'aseh hafrasha, and according to the Rambam and Tosfos, as we said, even for that, even to be matir the food, that it should be no longer tevel, even for that it's not enough machshava alone. You need machshava b'tziruf to the ma'aseh hafrasha. Continuing with the Matnos Kehuna, we have a very interesting Ktzos Hachoshen. This is in Choshen Mishpat, Siman Reish Mem Gimel, Hilchas Matana. There, the Mechaber writes that Katan shanoisnim leitzroir v'zorkoi egois v'noitloi zeichel ha'atzmai. That once a Katan has the understanding to differentiate between, let's say, a stone and a nut. So if you give him a stone, he doesn't want it, he throws it away. And if you give him an egois, a nut, he wants it, so he takes it. So once a Katan has that level of das, then if you give that Katan a matana, the Katan is zeiche in the matana. The Katan has the power to be koine that matana, and it becomes his. That's what the Mechaber says. And the Ramah adds to that, v'dafke ksheyesh das acheres makneloi avu b'metzia loi. So the Ramah says that there's a difference between a matana and a metzia. When does a Katan have the power to be zeiche? Only by a matana when there's a das acheres makne, meaning there's somebody else giving the matana, and the Katan is receiving it. So because of the das acheres makne, because of the power of the person who's giving the matana, we say that the Katan has the ability to be zeicher. But let's say if it's a metzia, where a Katan finds something on the street, and the Katan picks it up for himself, since there's no das acheres makne, there's nobody giving it to the Katan is just being zeicher la'atzmai. So then the Katan take does not have the ability to be zeicha, and even if the Katan picked it up, it does not become the Katan's. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. So the Ktzos brings from the Pri Chodesh that based on this, the Pri Chodesh wanted to explain a halacha. When it comes to Matnos Kehuna, let's say Teruma, we know that if a Yisrael gave his Teruma to a Katan, to a kohen who's a Katan, so the din is that the Yid was Mekayim the inyan of Teruma. Even though he gave it to a kohen who's a Katan, doesn't matter. He still was Mekayim the inyan of Teruma. The Nesinas HaTeruma l'kohen was fulfilled, and the Yid is fine. So the Chayra wouldn't be understood. Why should you be able to give Teruma to a kohen Katan? The Chayra Katan has no schiyah. If a Katan cannot be zeicher, so how is the Yid Mekayim the mitzvah of Nesinas HaTeruma by giving it to a kohen who's a Katan? So the Pri Chodesh wants to say that based on this Ramah, it's understood. Because since you have a das acheres makne, since you have here the Yid who's giving the Teruma, so the das acheres makne of the Yid giving the Teruma to the kohen who's a Katan, as we say here, the kohen has the power of schiyah. So the Katan is zeich in the Teruma, and then the Nesinas HaTeruma was accomplished. That's what the Pri Chodesh wanted to say. So the Ktzos says that he does not agree with the pshat of the Pri Chodesh. And he says you cannot consider Teruma to be das acheres makna. Why? Because das acheres makna means when the person giving the matana has a choice. He has a choice to give the matana or not to give the matana. So when he chooses to give a matana, that's a das acheres makna. So he's giving it, the power of his giving allows the Katan to be zeicha. When it comes to Teruma, he says, a Yid doesn't have a choice to give Teruma or not to give Teruma. A Yid is mechuyev to give Teruma. So since the giver is obligated to give the Teruma, he doesn't have a choice, so you cannot consider this das acheres makna. Even when the Yid gives it to a Kohen, the Yid's not giving it voluntarily. It's ke'ilu the Kohen is taking it against his will. What choice does the Jew have? And since the Kohen is able to take it against the will of the Yisrael, because the Yisrael is obligated to give it, so it's not das acheres makna. And even though the Yid could choose which Kohen to give it to, he doesn't have to give it to this Kohen, he could give it to that Kohen, he could give it to a different Kohen. We call this Taivas Hana. But the Ktzos says, we know Taivas Hana ain't a moment. The fact that you have the ability to choose which Kohen to give it to is not considered like it's your moment. So that's not enough to make a das acheres makna. Since at the end of the day, the Yid has to give away the Teruma, he doesn't have a choice. So the Ktzos says it's more daima to a Mitzvah. When a person picks up a Mitzvah, there's no one giving it to him, he's taking it on his own. Likewise here, when a Kohen gets Teruma, it's Ki'ilu, the Yid is not giving it to the Kohen because the Yid doesn't have a choice, he has to give it to the Kohen. It's Ki'ilu, the Kohen is just taking it, and there's no das acheres makna, and therefore, Hadra Kashya L'Duchdei, if you give Teruma to a Katan, L'chayra, the Katan should not be Zeicha. The Katan is not able to be Zeicha when there's no das acheres makna. So how come we're able to give Teruma to a Kohen who is a Katan? How is the Katan Zeicha in the Teruma? So the Ktzos himself wants to answer a different answer. He wants to say that really, I don't need the Yid, when the Yid is giving the Teruma to the Kohen, it's not really that the Yid is giving it to a Kohen. The Torah already gave it to the Kohen. The Kohanim already have a schiyah in the Teruma. It's kilu, it's already theirs. It's just that he has to pick it up. But when the Yid is giving the Teruma to the Kohen, it's not pshat that now the food belongs to the Yid. And the Yid is transferring it now by giving it to the Kohen. Now he's transferring it to the Rishus of the Kohen. No. The Teruma be'etzem already belongs to the Kohanim. The Torah gave it to the Kohanim and it belongs to them. It's already theirs. The Kohen is just sort of picking it up. He's just coming to collect it. So I don't really need here for the Katan to be Zeicha. I don't need a kinyan. I don't need a full transition from the Rishus of the Yisrael to the Rishus of the Kohen. It's kilu, it already belongs to the Kohanim. It's already Rishus HaKohanim because the Torah was mezakeh the Kohanim in the Teruma. So therefore, even if I give it to a Katan, I don't need schiyah of the Katan. The Katan is just picking it up. He's like the delivery person. The Katan is just picking it up. But I don't need the schiyah of the Katan, says the Ktzos, because the Torah was already mezakeh to the Kohanim and it already belongs to the Kohanim. He compares it, he says, just like a Katan is Yairish, because when a Katan is Yairish, I don't need him to be Zeiche, it's automatic. Once the father passes away, the Nechasim transfer to the Katan as the Yairish. So Al Derech over here, the Teruma is transferred automatically to the Kohanim through the power that the Torah gave, that the Torah was Mezakeh the Teruma to the Kohanim, and therefore I don't need a Schiyah of the Katan. The Kohanim just have to pick up the Teruma, but they don't need to be Zeiche in the Teruma midin kinyanim because it's already theirs mitzad the Torah.